Welcome to the Emancipate Your Mind podcast. I'm your host, certified religious transition and trauma recovery coach, Terry Hales. I help people step out of the shadows of religious fear and shame and embrace their authentic selves with love and empathy. If you're ready to throw off the shackles of learned binary thinking and explore a more nuanced approach to life, this is your playground. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Emancipate Your Mind podcast. It's so good to be back from Texas, and I'm excited to tackle this next segment. We're going to be talking about parenting after religious trauma, what it's like to parent, some of the concerns that we have, some of the common issues, and we will be deep diving into some of those issues in the episodes after today. But I thought it would be fun today to bring Kevin Hales, my husband and licensed therapist, onto the podcast today. We're going to talk about some of the concerns we had about parenting after leaving high demand religion, as well as some of the common concerns, anxieties, fears, and subconscious beliefs we have about parenting that we might have to overcome in order to create the healthy, safe environments that we're wanting to create for our kids after deconstructing from high demand religion. So welcome to the podcast, Kevin.
Thank you.
I'm excited for our conversation today. We've already kind of conversed a little bit before this in order to take some notes and make sure that we're on track. And I think we have some really good conversations to have today.
Yeah, I agree.
And it sounds like our cat wants to be part of this too. So she may come over and have things to say. Kevin's her favorite person. So she may join us on the podcast a little bit today. So I want us to rewind. It's been, what has it been? Has it been 6 years or 7 years? 6 years?
It depends what marker you're using to count how long. So
When we talked to the bishop and we were like, yeah, we need to step away.
I think that was April of 2017.
Yeah, I think you're right. So it's been a little over 6 years since we've stepped away from Mormonism.
Right.
And I remember that was kind of like, for me at least, when some of these fears about like, oh my gosh, how does this affect our kids really came to a head because we were taking that leap of stepping away from the Mormon church. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What were some of the big fears or anxieties or struggles when it came to parenting that came up for you when we decided to make that separation for at least the time being?
What do you mean by the time being?
Well, remember when we talked to the bishop, we were telling him that we were just stepping away. I think both you and I knew it was going to be more of a permanent move.
Yeah.
But I was at least in the back of my head telling myself that I could change my mind if I needed to.
Yeah.
That if it turned out bad, I could always make a different choice later on.
Yeah. When was it? Sorry, slightly off topic, but when was it the primary president asked if she could come and take our kids to church?
That was like 2 weeks after we had left. It was shortly after. But the bishop also asked us that, if you remember.
I don't remember that, no.
Yeah, so when we were there, he was like, okay, that makes sense if you need to take a step away, but would it be okay if we came and picked up your kids and continued to bring them to church? Which now feels like such a breach of boundaries.
Oh, it is. It's predatory. I mean, I'm just thinking about that. And I think we remember being pretty, pissed that they would even ask that. But yeah, it's just such a predatory thing to do to hone in on your kids, because if we can, I don't know, I'm not even sure what the thought process is behind that, other than, trying to control you and your family. I mean, I remember as a missionary, we would almost always target, women, because they could convince the husband, to come, even though he may not be interested initially, and the kids as well, I guess, to a certain extent. Now that I think about it, because if you can rope the woman and the kids in, then that would often bring the man as well. So,
yeah, I mean, that's what happened in my family growing up. My mom joined the church.
Right.
We all were part of the church, and I remember being a huge influence on my dad as a young kid,
right,
pouring his beer down the drain, getting on his case for playing poker, just I was kind of a punk to my dad as a young child,
Yeah.
but I think it did have a large influence on him eventually joining the church whenever I was 7. Yeah. No, I remember telling the bishop that if we felt like the church was not something that was good for us, why would we want our kids to continue to be picked up and taken?
Yeah.
But that didn't even make sense.
No, because that's, for anyone that's in their church and religion, they are, willingly or unknowingly burying their head in the sand and trying to ignore the negative aspects. And so it's the idea that it would somehow be unhealthy or not good wouldn't cross most people's minds. And all they can think is that this is such a great place and such a great way to raise your kids. And I don't think we would say it's all bad, otherwise, why would somebody join a cult? But yeah, I mean, there's probably those good positive aspects, but at what cost?
Yeah.
At what cost do I have to pay to be in that environment? So I guess going back to your question, yeah, I mean, there's, I think, generally a lot of fear for people because maybe they grew up in this religion or this environment, and again, you can probably see some of the good in it, but I think there's a lot of fear because there's a lot of milestones and expectations about how your kids are supposed to grow up and what they're supposed to do at certain ages and the path that they're supposed to follow. And so, when you don't believe anymore and when you're struggling to play along, then that often turns, to your kids eventually at some point. And then of course, what do we do then? And do I want them being in that environment? And I don't know, probably a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I know several people who are in mixed faith marriages who really struggle with, how much exposure should their kids have to the church? How harmful will it end up being? And I think maybe that's a good place for us to start is, let's say a couple is in a mixed faith relationship where kids have the choice or maybe don't have the choice to either go to church with one parent or stay home with the other. And I think for many of us, whenever we've left high demand religion, some of that black and white thinking kind of comes with us, right? Where it's all or nothing. And so, and I think it creates a lot of tension in marriages and in families, because if you have one parent that's like, they have to go or they won't be good people. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. And the other one is saying, no, this is harmful. This created a lot of harm for me. And I think it's like they've lied about a lot of things or they've hidden a lot of things. And I don't want my kid to be a part of that. I think it's damaging. It can become kind of this battle of, either we're doing it all because that's what makes a good kid, or we're not doing any of it because that's how I am going to protect my child. How do we find that middle ground between the parent who's going and the parent who does not want to go anymore? And how do we give our kids a safe space to kind of process and figure out what they want?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a hard scenario to be in. And I don't think there's a concrete, all-encompassing answer because it's going to be different for each couple. But yeah, that's what a lot of couples have to determine. One parent doesn't want their kid to get baptized or go to certain church events anymore, and the other parent probably does, and so how do we get on the same page with that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Again, there's probably going to have to be some compromise met there if there's going to be a continued relationship together. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if there is a good answer to that question.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that you would have to like negotiate between both parents and with the kids. depending on their ages,
Right.
especially.
Depending on their ages. Yeah. Because if obviously if they're old enough, they might, already have their own opinion and maybe they want to go or maybe they don't want to anymore. And I think we need to take that into account.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's talk about that. How do we talk with our kids about what they want or don't want? How do we have boundary seems to be like a really big issue when we're leaving high demand religion, both for ourselves. Like we're still trying to navigate like what are boundaries? How do I set them? How do I honor my own boundaries? How do I even know what my boundaries are? And now we're trying to also teach our kids those things, like how they can have boundaries, and we're trying to help them navigate that. And it sounds like this is kind of part of that process, talking with our kids and finding out what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And as our kids age, obviously they have more autonomy and more control over their own lives. They become separate people from us. They're always separate people from us, but they have more control over what they do and don't do. So what does that look like as our kids are young, trying to like work with them to create something that works for them and within the family dynamics versus as they age and we're giving them kind of more space to spread those wings and fly?
Well, like we've talked about before, I think maybe one of the fundamental things to address is how you view the child,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to affect how you approach them, and if you even consider them as being able to have boundaries, because if you, well, I don't know, maybe we should address that, because how you view your child, how you view the whole parenting process is going to determine whether you even think they should have boundaries. Because I think some parents would balk at that idea that your kids should have boundaries and you should be including them in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Especially like when we were still in Mormonism, I viewed our kids as people I was supposed to shape
Right.
and mold. I think we've talked about that on this podcast a couple of times. In the scriptures, it says, train up your child when they're young, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. I thought it was my job to train them who to be and how to be in the world
Mm-hmm.
so that they would grow up to be successful adults, I guess.
Right.
And I view it differently now. I still have a role in shaping, like helping them learn and figure out what they want and like supporting them in trying things on. But I don't feel like it's my role any longer to be like, here's the pattern and here's how you fit yourself into the pattern.
Right.
Yeah. How about you? How do you see that?
No, I mean, I think the same. You were just telling one of our friends that story the other day about how you were teaching the young women and talking about lying. And
They were actually 8-year-olds.
oh, geez, I thought they were at least young women age. So.
I was teaching the 8-year-olds who were getting ready to be baptized that year. And we had a lesson on lying, and it was very black and white.
Right.
I didn't even realize I was nuanced at the time.
Right.
I just remember being like, they were saying, you should always, always, always tell the truth. And I was immediately like, well, what if someone is asking if your mom is here with you at the park? Like, it is not good to tell them, oh, no, I'm here by myself. I'm here with just my friends. Or, if the school bully is like, did you bring lunch money today?
Mm-hmm.
Like telling them, oh, yeah, I have $10 in my pocket that's not a useful bit of information. It's not something they need to know. And it's absolutely okay to be untruthful about that in order to protect yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah, asking them questions to help them start thinking and be more nuanced. And I remember feeling so naughty that I was instilling this idea that 100% truthfulness was not always in your best interest, that there were times to omit information because it could be harmful to you. And there were times to actually straight up say the opposite of the truth in order to protect your physical, mental, or emotional safety.
Right. Well, and that's without even realizing it, you were teaching them the beginnings of having boundaries, and because again, there's you know, so few boundaries, definitely in Mormonism, and I would assume this is probably true across most religions. There's an expectation to reveal a lot more about yourself and your life and your sex life and your. In fact, I think I just saw like a post the other day on Reddit. I don't remember which subreddit it was, but apparently it was an application for the college sports team, and they had several questions about when was your first period, how frequently is your period, and just like all these like what, like, why are you even asking us? What does this have to do with you know applying for the sports team? And I want to say maybe it was volleyball or something, but anyways, it was just like there's a lot of situations like that where you are asked personal questions, and when it's done within these circumstances, you often just assume it's normal or proper, even though you're probably extremely uncomfortable. And so that was something we had to learn leaving as well, is you know creating those boundaries and saying, wait, why am I telling you this, or why do I feel like I should tell you this? And and drawing those boundaries, but then to your point, also helping our children draw their boundaries and discover what their boundaries are, because obviously they aren't immediately going to know. But I think, at least for me, a general rule of thumb is when discovering your boundaries and helping your kids with their boundaries, it's going to be a situation where you're triggered by something and you're angry or hurt, or something sets you off, something, it just does not feel right or comfortable. That's probably a good sign that there's been a boundary crossed. And so if you see that happening with your child, then we can try to have that discussion with them and try to figure out, okay, what just happened there? What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I was actually just having a conversation with one of our kids today about boundaries, actually just a couple of hours ago, and talking about what I noticed with them emotionally when it came to availability on the phone and phone calls.
Yeah.
And so one of our kids has a friend that has impulse control issues, and we'll call. And then if he doesn't answer, we'll call again. And if he doesn't answer, we'll continue to call and call and call. And you can see the building anxiety in our child. And so we talked about boundaries and how, if it's negatively impacting you, if it's creating anxiety in your life, if it's creating a sense of, inability to be at peace or to feel safe, that, you might need to decide what is okay and what is not okay with you. And our kid actually kind of tried on a couple of solutions and threw them out there for our other child and I to kind of comment on, and said, I'm okay with my friend calling anytime they want to, but sometimes I feel like I have to pick up or the phone's just going to keep ringing. And we've noticed this kid pick up the phone in the middle of dinner, pick up the phone in the middle of a conversation with us, pick up the phone when they're trying to get dressed for school. And he said, well, maybe, he could call me once. If I don't answer, he could call one more time just to see if I didn't get to the phone in time. But then if I don't answer twice, maybe the boundary is he leaves a message for me and I'll get to him when I can. And maybe I just need to have a conversation about the expectation. And then we had a chance to say, that's a great place to start, setting the expectation. What will you do if he continues to demon dial you? What will you do if he continues to call over and over? And he sat there for a minute, and I was so proud of him because he said, I think at that point I'd put my phone on silent or do not disturb for a while and just protect my peace. Like, he can continue to call 50 bazillion times that day if he needs to, but I won't hear it. And I was like, that's a great example of boundaries, because he wasn't going to call him and yell at him or tell him to stop. He was just like, what can I do to keep my phone from ringing and making me feel anxious? I was really proud of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's a conversation he said he was going to be having today.
Nice.
To try to mitigate some of that anxiety and those issues that were coming up with phone calls.
Nice.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't always go perfectly. I still feel like I'm trying to figure out my own boundaries. So sometimes there's some friction. even with our kids when they set boundaries.
Right. It's constantly a work in progress. It's, you don't just draw that line in the sand and then boom, suddenly you're good from there on out. Boundaries, I think, are constantly fluctuating. They're constantly needing to be adjusted and adapted.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's something that you continue to edit and work through as your kids grow because those things change. Yeah, boundaries are difficult because I feel like we're all still not only deconstructing some of those subconscious beliefs about what boundaries are, whether we should have them or not, whether they're healthy or unhealthy, but also I feel like there's some subconscious feelings about what it means when someone sets a boundary with you. And there's like some triggers, I feel like sometimes like some hurt or some shame that still come up occasionally from the background. So how do we work with that when our kids are setting boundaries with us or with our parents or with somebody else and it brings up embarrassment or feelings of shame? Or like, for instance, if you're at your parents' house and your kids decide they don't want to hug relatives or they don't want to like, be close or interact with relatives. Because I think sometimes we get our sense of self-worth or our sense of like, I'm a good person by how our kids act. And sometimes that brings up some shame or some feelings of embarrassment about who we are as parents because our kids are setting boundaries or just acting differently than maybe we would act in that situation. So how do we deal with that?
I guess my initial response is just that's going to be an individual thing to work through. If you're embarrassed because of a boundary you're setting, then that maybe means you're probably not totally confident in why you're setting the boundary. I mean, boundaries are a very personal thing. I'm setting the boundary because, I need this to keep me safe or comfortable or at peace. And we don't need other people's approval for that. And so if I'm feeling embarrassed about setting a boundary, then that probably says that you're not totally confident in why you're trying to set this boundary. Or, I don't know. It depends on the circumstances, I think.
I think I was talking more about like when we feel embarrassed when our kids set a boundary.
Okay. So again, I think that would be partly our own work to do, because if I'm feeling embarrassed by a boundary they're setting, it's not about me. It's about that child and the boundary that they're setting. And maybe I'm more wrapped up in how I think their boundary setting is going to reflect on me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so are we going to support and assist our children in their boundary setting, or are we wanting them to set boundaries that, make us look good or make us feel comfortable? And that's, of course, the wrong reason to make them set that kind of a boundary.
Yeah. So how do we work through that? How do we do that work that is ours to do? I know that's a really complex question, but like, I know getting curious is always going to be the first step, like why we're having the reaction that we're having.
Yeah. I mean, we've got to get curious about, what's making us uncomfortable. And it's, I guess, in general, parenting is not so much about us. It's more about the child. How do, you've said several times, we want our kids to feel safe. So how do we help them feel safe? How do we tend to their needs? And that's the goal here. It's so again, if I'm uncomfortable by something, but they're wanting or needing or setting a certain boundary because they need that, then we need to, I guess, learn how to respect that and to try to support them in that, even though maybe I don't necessarily like it or I don't necessarily agree to it. It's yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question other than just to say it's our own personal work, because otherwise we're making their boundary setting about me. And that's not okay.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the biggest issues that a lot of us have coming out of high demand religion is the conflation between ourselves and our kids.
Right.
Because I think a lot of that happens particularly in high demand Christianity and Christian adjacent religions where our kids are seen as extensions of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think you've used the term like lumps of clay to mold.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as we're viewing them as lumps of clay that we're supposed to mold or extensions of who we are or how good of parents we are,
Mm-hmm.
then that's when we run into those issues with boundary setting embarrassment or life choice embarrassment, and inability to just accept and nurture our kids as they are instead of as we feel they should be.
Right. Right. Which is why we sometimes apologize on our kids' behalf, to other people because we're feeling embarrassed. We don't maybe approve of their behavior or how they're acting or what they're doing in certain situations.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I mean, I guess going back to my earlier comment, I think a lot of how we handle these situations depends on how we view our kids. I've got, one client who's very Christian. And so anytime she talks about the kids, she's very black and white about that's not okay, and she shouldn't be saying that or she shouldn't be doing that. It's very clear in her head that, there are certain things that child should and shouldn't be doing. And so the expectation then at that point is for her husband to step in and correct the kids, tell them what they're doing wrong. And then the expectation is the kid will fall in line and behave appropriately. So they're very much viewing children and the parental process as this molding that piece of pottery into the shape that you want it to be. And of course, that's just not how it works, or at least it shouldn't be. If we want our kids to be critically thinking, independent minded, people, then we have to nurture that, not nurture this submissive, acquiescent, crushed soul, which is, I think, the outcome of most traditional parenting approaches.
Yeah. One of the questions that comes to mind for me now, like knowing several teachers in the teaching system where maybe parents have been like, you become you, but haven't been taught maybe empathy or haven't been taught how to interact with other people and not only like look out for their own needs and wants and desires and boundaries, but also to understand other people's feelings, needs, wants, and desires. How do we mitigate that? Because that's, I think, one of the big pieces that comes up for people leaving high demand religion, because sometimes we slingshot to the opposite, right? We had all these rigid rules and regulations about how we should be and shouldn't be. And sometimes we take off all guidelines and rules and we just say, like, you do you, like, go out and be, but that creates its own set of problems.
Right.
So how do we find that? Like, again, how do we come into the middle of that spectrum where we're honoring who the child is and what their boundaries are, but again, like helping them recognize other people's humanity and empathize with others and like be respectful and compassionate and kind as we're navigating getting our own needs met and showing up authentically in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard balance, but I think you're correct in looking at it as there's a happy medium somewhere in there that ideally we're seeking. And it shouldn't be either extreme. It shouldn't be, super laissez-faire, and it shouldn't be super tyrannical. There needs to be some happy medium in there. And I guess one of the answers to that question is, approaching our children in age appropriate ways. So, we're not trying to have a conversation with a toddler about, boundaries and, sex and other, complex topics, because they clearly don't have the ability to understand and contribute to that conversation. So the amount of control that we have over a child's life is going to be much higher when they're younger. And ideally, as the child gets older, we relinquish more and more of that control and allow them to make their own decisions and to make their own mistakes, because we'll be there to support them and to help them learn from those mistakes. So, for example, both of our kids are at the Renaissance Fair today, and you were giving Kent some cash to spend on anything he wants to buy there, and so he put it in his pocket. And I don't know, I'm not terribly confident that pocket is super secure. That money could come falling out, but it might not,
Mm-hmm.
But you kept giving him options. Maybe Wes could hold the money in his wallet. Maybe, it could be put somewhere else, more secure. But
Ultimately, he decided he wanted it in his
yeah,
pocket.
he kept insisting, no, I just want it here in this pocket. He seemed confident it wasn't going to go anywhere, and so I guess we'll see,
Yeah.
and if he does lose that cash, then hopefully he learns something from that, and is more careful next time. So it's, and then, like, one of the examples I always think of is, when your kid is small and they're starting to, spout their opinion a little bit more. Let's say it's snowing outside, and you're like, all right, let's put a coat on. And they're like, no. And you're like, but it's cold out there. Let's put a coat. No, and maybe they can keep insisting they don't want to put their coat on or put their shoes on or something. And so I think it's important to allow them to, in some of these situations, assuming it can be done relatively safely and so forth, let them make the decision, and maybe they don't wear that coat, but within a couple of minutes of going outside, maybe they change their mind, and then we can let them put the coat on at that point. And I think we have to be careful, because it's easy to launch into lecture mode and tell them, I told you so, and next time you need to listen to me. But again, hopefully that's not the relationship we're trying to have with them. It's one where we're creating a safe environment for them to make mistakes. And again, that a lot of this just goes back to what is the underlying philosophy and how we view parenting a child. If you view it as trying to control and manipulate and mold this child into the creature you're wanting them to be, then that's going to affect how you approach them in these situations. But if you view them as this small human being who is going to have their own opinions and ideas, and that's okay, and you're not going to be threatened by that, and you're going to want to encourage that and nurture that, and that means we're going to let them make some mistakes. It's okay that they make mistakes. Some of our best lessons in life are learned from our own mistakes, and of course not see that as a bad thing, which, if you're in religion, most of the time we're striving to be perfect, and so mistakes are always seen as a negative and a bad thing. So trying to encourage that environment for them to spread their wings, fall out of the nest and be there to help pick them up, not necessarily to be there to catch them, or keep them from ever getting hurt. We'll do that to a certain extent, but we shouldn't be doing that in every situation.
Yeah. Yeah, you actually bring up a really good point that I think sometimes, especially when we've experienced adverse childhood experiences, or trauma of some sort in our childhood, sometimes what can affect our parenting is this deep desire, because we love our kids, to protect them from all childhood adverse experiences or harm themselves. And obviously we want to try to protect our kids from big T traumas, right? Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, as much as possible, right? Physical abuse. But part of growing up is that we will all experience some little T traumas. We're going to have times where we feel rejected by friends. We're going to have times when we embarrass ourselves on stage at school. We're going to have times when we fail on our report card and we have to do summer school. And we don't really get the summer that we hoped we would have. Sometimes we, fail the driving exam, or we're turned down by the girl that we ask on a date. And these can be little T traumas.
Yeah.
But I think some of us feel like we're supposed to protect our kids from all trauma ever, which includes all failure, all mistakes. And we overparent to a certain extent. trying to keep them from having any kind of adverse experiences. And I think sometimes that comes from a deep sense of empathy and love for our kids, but I think sometimes it also comes from this reparenting that needs to happen for our own inner child. And we project that onto our kids, right? Like we still have wounds from our own childhood that we are maybe projecting onto our kids and trying to, like, in empathy for our own selves, like trying to shield and protect that for our kids as well. And we rob them of the opportunity to recognize that they can go through hard things and survive it, that they have the ability to problem solve and pick themselves up again, like you said, and that they can trust themselves. When we allow our kids to go through some of these small T traumas and some of the failures and mistakes that are part of growing up, they are learning through that experience that they can trust themselves to do hard things and come out the other side and be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really hard and continues actually to be really hard to learn on my part, that I need to, like, kind of step back, be there as a support, but not like you said, catch them. So what are some ideas that we have? I'm like racking my brain. This is a conversation, so I didn't necessarily come with all my bullet points that I normally have. But how do we move into that space where we're creating safety for our kids to try things on, make wrong decisions, and work through those wrong decisions, those failures, and those small T traumas that just happen from being human?
Well, again, like we've kind of touched on throughout this conversation, a lot of it, I think, centers around how we view the whole parenting process. Do we view our children as these moldable items and things that we need to control and manipulate, make them walk in a specific path, because that's creating this unhealthy dynamic between parent and child? Or are we seeing them as I believe they are, which are these little creatures that we have contributed genetic material to or not, if they're adopted? But either way, we have taken upon ourselves the responsibility to raise them in the best way that we know how. But there is no perfect way to raise the child. We've got to get rid of that idea and that concept that there is a path, there is a program, there is a checklist that we as their parents and they as children have to follow for them to be good people. There's plenty of exceptions in the world where maybe somebody grew up in a toxic, abusive, neglectful home, but still turned out to be a pretty decent, person, and or vice versa. Somebody grows up in what, is, a relatively loving and, safe environment, but they turn out, to go in a different direction that may be
self-destructive.
Yeah. Self-destructive and hard to understand. I don't want to say the wrong direction because again, those concepts of right and wrong ways to grow up and be as a person, I think have largely gone out the window for me. So,
yeah. I always think of the movie Wild, or I guess the book Wild by Cheryl Strayed.
Yeah.
Where she talks about how, the main character, she gets into heroin and then she said, maybe
heroin taught me something.
Yeah, maybe heroin taught me something. Like, obviously her parents probably would not have chosen heroin as the path that she went down, but she learned something from it. And so was it self-destructive for a time? For sure. And then she went on this journey of recognizing that she was on a self-destructive path and learned quite a bit from it, from the self-destructive choices and the harm it brought into her life, which ultimately led her to write the book because it is an autobiography. I think it's so interesting how often, even religious trauma, like the choices I made in high demand religion have taught me like some of the hardest but most influential lessons in my life on the importance of curiosity, empathy, critical thinking, being open-minded to other ways of living and being, And I just had, I was just down in Texas and having conversations with all of my multitude of Christian / Mormon / non-denominational family. And one of them said, like, if you could go back, you could rewind the clock. Would you choose to continue to be Mormon? Like, if you knew everything you knew now? I was like, well, if I knew everything I knew now, probably I wouldn't continue to be Mormon. I was like, however, it's really hard to go back and say, I wish I had done something different, because it made me who I am today. And I like who I am today. And I don't know that I would have been the same person. I would have lost a lot of gifts having not gone through the struggles.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. Which again requires us to look at mistakes through a different lens, not see them as necessarily mistakes or see them as bad things. But rather just, I mean, I've tried to redefine the word failure or mistake, because obviously those words denote that it was bad or it shouldn't have happened. But I think really all a mistake or a failure is, in essence, is something not happening the way we had anticipated it.
mm-hmm.
That's it. And so if I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, but if I'm expecting a certain outcome and it doesn't happen that way, that's usually going to upset and bother us. And we're going to probably see it as a mistake or something that was bad. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, because hopefully we've learned something from that experience. And it's something that, we can gain from and implement into how we do things, maybe differently next time to get the outcome that we ultimately want.
Yeah. We Thomas Edison it. He said, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb work. Or
right.
I probably just butchered that, but that's basically what he said. Like, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work.
Right.
That doesn't mean I've failed. I'm just marking off things that don't work. So,
right. He's learning from each of those experiences. And
yeah.
So I guess, again, I keep saying a lot of this has to do with how we view the parenting process, but maybe part of how we look at the parenting process also is determined by how we look at human nature and ourselves, because that's part of what has influenced a lot of the parenting practices in the past, is the idea that, our children are evil or,
inherently sinful,
and they need to be corrected and they need to be, taught a lesson and all these ideas. And
we need to beat the devil out of them.
Right. And so human nature, and so that's significantly changed how I, look at human behavior. Now, I don't, like if something evil or horrific happens, I don't just assume that the person who did it is evil or horrific anymore. It's, I mean, they clearly did something evil and horrific, but there's probably a long history of trauma and abuse and neglect and
mental illness
and a whole host of things that led up to that moment and that point. To believe that someone just because they're evil at their core just decided, just woke up someday and said, I think I'm going to go shoot up a school. I think I'm going to go rape this person. It's like it's that we're oversimplifying, what are clearly complex problems and issues. And so that's how, I approach, just about every situation now. I'm trying to look for and to understand the reasons certain things are happening or why people are behaving the way they are, rather than just assuming they're just rebellious. They're just lazy. They're just evil, that what we've just done in saying those things is we've cut off our critical thinking. We're not actually trying to think about it anymore. We're not trying to empathize or understand or comprehend where they're coming from or why they would behave in this way. We've made up our mind. This is who they are. And now we're just pissed.
Yeah.
And and we're not actually going to, I think, find any peace or understanding in that, because we have just made this overly simplistic conclusion about, this person and what's going on. And so, oftentimes when I meet with the parents of teenagers, that's what I'm trying to get them to see is, your child isn't just inherently lazy or or bad or rebellious or any of these things. That all of these things are normal. When we're rebellious as human beings, that's normal. It means we're pushing back against something that we don't like and we don't agree with. And so,
and in teenagerhood, we're trying to figure out our own identities separate from our parents,
right,
which could lead to rebelliousness as well. It's
right,
necessary for
right,
adult identity.
right. And rebelliousness isn't just part of adolescence. All of us are rebellious. How many of us speed? Because we don't like the speed limit. That's us rebelling. How many of us, cut into a long line? Even though socially, most people are like, hey, you shouldn't be cutting lines. But I mean, sometimes we cut lines because we don't want to wait. Sometimes I'm trying to think of other examples, but I mean, all of us rebel from time to time. We're told we have to do something, or this is, we'll take the whole COVID thing, right? People not wearing masks, that's them rebelling against, authority figures telling them that you should be doing this. Lots of people were happy to put on masks though, because they felt like it was the safe and appropriate thing to do during, a pandemic, and so on and so forth, right?
Quiet quitting at work.
Yeah, quiet.
Like where you're just doing the bare minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going above and beyond like your boss expects you to, or the company culture expects you to. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So rebelling is just part of being human. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, if anything, anytime we do find ourselves being rebellious about something, we should try to get curious and understand, why am I doing that? What is it that I don't agree with and that I don't like here? And again, try to extend that same curiosity to your kids, when you see them maybe not obeying or not doing the things you're asking them to or telling them to. It's important to better understand where that's coming from.
Yeah. Well, and it's been interesting. Like the example that comes to mind for me is grades. One of our kids was struggling a little bit with grades, and getting curious with him about what was going on actually led us to a lot of great solutions to try on over the past 2 years. Because I could have just assumed that he was not listening, checked out, but because of all of the work we've done since leaving high demand religion, and what I know about him is generally like he wants to do well.
Mm-hmm.
Just asking him like, hey, what's going on? What's happening here? And making that safe environment to get curious, like letting him know, like, I'm not angry. I just want to understand what's happening so that we can find solutions that work for you to get you what you want. And that led to trying things on and failing spectacularly, and doing some summer school even, and learning from that, and just continuing to try things on and adjust to a point where he's found things that work for him pretty well, at least up to this point. That doesn't mean we won't have to adjust more, but checking in with him about what he wants for his life too, and what matters to him. Because I think many of us were raised with, you have to go to college, and in order to go to college, you must have this GPA, and you must do this well on tests. And that actually wasn't what he wanted for himself. And it completely changed the parameters of what we were aiming for in the first place.
Right.
So, yeah.
And again, it's a lot of that should cause us as parents to self-reflect. If we're bothered that they're not getting straight A's, if we're bothered that they're not going to get into a certain college, if we're bothered that they're not wanting to go to school, and a whole host of things, it's not just that they're lazy or inherently bad. We need to, I think, get more creative in how we envision our child's future. It needs to be something more aligned to who they are,
and what they want, what brings them joy.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we're afraid that they're going to be living in a van down by the river, Well, guess what? Maybe they want to live in a van.
Gen Zers that love living in their vans down by the river right now. There's whole TikToks about
And
it.
again, maybe that's not what I envisioned, or maybe that's not what I wanted for them, but it's not about you.
Mm-hmm.
What does your child want? What future do they envision? Now, a lot of parents will say, well, if I ask my son or daughter that question, they don't answer, or they just say, I don't know. Well, if you already have kids that are that at that point and they're not answering, that's probably because there's a history of them being shut down or their ideas and feelings dismissed. And so then we have to go back to the table to, I don't know, repair or try to make up for that environment that's been there in the past. When children are naturally, wanting to talk and open and share. And so when we have a child that's shut down, there's probably a history of them being shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we try to just ask them a question now and include them in certain things, they're probably not going to just immediately rebound back and start opening up.
Especially as teens.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I feel like it takes some time of them seeing, like, I really am curious. And it also takes accountability. That's one of the things I've learned the most, I think, from coaching is we don't want perfect parents. We want parents who are empathic, curious, and accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're recognizing that our kid is shutting down a lot, I think it goes a long way, and it will take a lot of patience and perseverance on our part to make that repair and to recognize, like, hey, in the past, I may have shut you down and made it feel like it's unsafe for you to share your honest thoughts and opinions. And I'd like to change that. I can't promise I'll be perfect at it, but I'd like you to let me know whenever it feels like I'm shutting you down so that I can recognize when I'm doing it and make amends right there in the moment so that we can feel safer with one another, because I really am curious about your life and I want to be included. And I know I've done some damage.
Yeah.
And you'll have to practice that. Yeah. Because undoing those patterns takes time. You'll have to practice it for a while. You'll have to apologize a lot. You'll have to get curious when they shut down again, because they might not say, hey, you're doing it right now, but you might have to say, I noticed you just shut down again. What did I do? And what happened there that created that feeling of unsafety for you where you shut down? And just letting them know, like, I'm here, giving them time to process because they might not know, and continuing to follow up and just let them know, like, I'm here when you want to talk, not forcing them to talk, but being like, I'm here when you feel like you'd like to share, however you want to share, however much you want to share. I'm here for it. And I'm committed to this, not just now while you're a teenager, but throughout your life.
Right.
I think goes a really, really long way towards repairing some of those patterns we develop with our kids,
right,
based on some of the patterns that we grew up with as kids. And I think there's room here for a lot of self-compassion, because we're healing generational patterns as we're trying to parent kids with different patterns, and we are going to mess it up and revert to old patterns. And sometimes we're going to act from ways that are, subconscious indoctrination, both from our families and society and from religion. And just recognizing when things aren't working the way we'd like them to with our kids, getting curious about it with ourselves, opening up the conversation with our kids to figure out what their experience has been like, and then working together to figure out something to try on and come back and figure out how that's working. And just, you keep that process up until you find something that works for both of you, at least for the time being, understanding that our kids will continue to evolve and change. And that means we'll continue to have to evolve and change and have conversations about what feels good for us both.
Right.
I mean, we're having conversations with our kids now as they're moving into their teenage years, and we're evolving from a parent-child relationship where I'm the giver and they're the taker into more adult relationships now where I'm starting to ask for some mutuality. And so we're trying to navigate that to figure out what works for us both, so that we can start practicing now more of an adult relationship as they're taking on more adult responsibility for their lives.
Right. Like I said earlier, when they're younger, we have more control and say in their lives and what they're doing. And that should be a gradual release of that control and say in things as they get older. It's I don't know, I feel like there's a name for that. It's like an inverse, relationship or something. Like when you see on those graphs, your level of control is up here, and that's according to their low age down here. And then as their age increases, your level of control decreases.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, like the phrase that always comes to mind for me is eventually, as they get older, and not necessarily right at the age of 18, but when they are more adult like, eventually our role as a parent needs to change from being a manager to a consultant.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
So I've always liked that idea that, you don't stop being a parent when they become adults and go out into the world. But some parents still try to maintain that same level of control and influence over their children's lives, even when they are adults.
Yeah.
And so rather than being a manager and trying to control and dictate and manipulate everything going on in their lives, it should be more of a consultant role, one that's more respectful and more equal, and not one that's overly strong in its influence over that person and over their lives.
Yeah. And I think we begin practicing that when they're still living at home.
Exactly.
Before the age of 18.
Exactly.
We start delegating some of that. Well, what do you feel like would work best for you?
Right.
What options have you thought about?
Right.
What are the pros and cons to each of those options? Which one looks the most appealing to you and why?
Right.
Like beginning to become that voice that we are trying to develop in our own heads, helping us problem solve and figure out the direction for our lives now that we're healing from high demand religion, becoming that framework for themselves to ask themselves questions to help themselves get to know what they want, what would work for them, what sounds appealing and exciting, what sounds absolutely unappealing and disgusting to them, and how to come up with a plan to try something on, and then how to check in with themselves to see if it's working or not.
Right. And again, helping them understand that there's no right or wrong choices in what they're doing, help them evaluate, did this have the outcome that I was seeking? Mm-hmm. If not, let's reevaluate, because that's the trouble, is when we are raised to be obedient and to acquiesce to people in positions of authority, we can also alleviate ourselves of the guilt or the shame of things not turning out the way we want. Mm-hmm. And once we start to learn to do that for ourselves, so for example, coming out of religion or a cult, that's a heavy burden a lot of people have to deal with, is when they're making the choice for themselves, and again, it doesn't turn out the way they hoped or wanted, there's a lot of guilt and shame that they have to process and work through, because they feel like they're making a wrong choice or a bad choice. And they're not. It's just not having the outcome you were expecting. And so maybe we need to change our expectations, or maybe we need to, reevaluate what it is we're seeking, or what exactly we're wanting. What is the result I'm wanting in this situation? So and then helping our kids do that, helping our kids realize, oh, whoops, this didn't turn out the way you'd hoped, or whoops, this is, so if Kent loses his money today, we'll have that talk and go, well, I'm so sorry, buddy, lead with the empathy. So sorry that happened. What do you think happened? Yeah, your pockets maybe weren't, tight enough, or they weren't deep enough or whatever. And, what can we do differently next time? And we don't need to shame him. We don't need to lecture him. Just, be there to support him if things don't go the way he was hoping. Mm-hmm. So
unfortunately, the lessons that we learn the best come from our own experiences that did not go the way we were hoping. Mm-hmm. It's when we learn the most. So allowing that to happen with $20, I would much rather that happen right now with $20 than with $500,
Right.
So I feel like we've talked about a lot of good things today. We're going to be talking about more in-depth topics, in the upcoming months. But is there anything else you wanted to say today as we're wrapping up? Is there anything else still on your mind?
Yeah, I don't know. Not that I can think of. I'm thinking back to those initial days and weeks and months of leaving our cult and having to get comfortable with that whole experience. And I guess going back to what we've talked about already, it was helpful to realize and remind ourselves that, you know, our kids don't have to have a religion, a God, a person who supposedly stands in between us and God. We don't have to have those people telling us what to do and how to believe and how to, live our lives. And so, therefore, alleviating yourself of the fear that there's a right path and a right way for our kids to be raised has really liberated a lot of that for myself personally. And now, and I think in my mind, what constitutes a good parent? What is a good parent? It's in my mind, it's a parent who is, like you said, is accountable and empathetic, and they're always there to touch base with their kid and say, "Hey, how are things going? How am I doing?" And being willing to adjust and adapt.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what being a good parent is in a nutshell. For me, it's that willingness to constantly check in with our kids and see how they're doing, create a safe environment to speak freely, and adapting and adjusting and trying to meet their needs as much as possible, and supporting whatever path they want to follow, and what direction they want to go in. Again, rather than the old way of believing there's a one right way to do it and forcing our kids to fit into that mold.
Yeah.
That's never going to turn out well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I love all those points. I think the only thing I'd add, and it's no surprise to the people listening to the podcast, because it seems to be like my buzzword, is just remaining as curious and open-minded as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of drawing conclusions, asking curiosity questions,
Mm-hmm.
getting their feedback and figuring out how they feel
Mm-hmm.
things are going. I feel like it helps our kids so much when we ask curiosity questions, because it allows them to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So often, I think they haven't thought through whether this worked for them or didn't work for them, or how they feel about it, until they're asked questions and get a chance to sit and think through it in a safe environment where it's okay for them to not have all the answers, and with somebody kind of guiding them with those curiosity questions. And then they learn to do that for themselves. And I think it helps us just understand what's at the heart of our kids.
Yeah.
So much more than the assumptions we make about them. Because so often their motives, their intentions are completely different than what we assumed their motives and intentions were.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that that's been really helpful. But I'm excited to delve into parenting. This is something I haven't felt completely comfortable talking about until quite right now,
mm-hmm.
mainly because when we first left high demand religion, one of the big fears for me, because everyone thinks that your kids are going to become delinquents,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed some time to see how you and I and our kids working together, how that was going to turn out
Right.
for our kids. And we've been doing this now for 6 years, and our kids, I'm sure, will make their fair share of mistakes and things that they or even us may not be proud of at some point. And yet I feel really confident that they are gaining tools to work through those things when the time comes, and that they will learn from those experiences and really become some cool humans that contribute the things that they were meant to contribute to the world. So
yeah.
I like who they are now. I have a feeling, I will continue to like who they are as they become who they're becoming.
Mhm.
And I'm excited to talk about some of the hard lessons and imperfect experiences we've had over the past 6 years. And I'm still learning. I don't have all the answers. I would say you probably feel like you don't have all the answers,
No.
but I'm excited to explore some of the topics in the upcoming months. But thank you for helping me kick off this segment and just have a conversation with me. And I hope you guys have all enjoyed this. And I look forward to your questions on the call on Wednesday. We're still doing calls every Wednesday, 6:30 Mountain Time. If you want to be involved in that, please go to the website at emancipateyourmind.org. All donors, all monthly donors, regardless of the amount, are included in the email list where you get the link to join the call on Wednesdays. And if you want to expedite that process, after you've clicked the monthly donation box and chosen the amount you would like to donate, please send me a message at terry@emancipatedcoaching.com and let me know that you've donated so that I can make sure you're getting that monthly email as soon as possible. If that's something you'd like to be a part of, we'd love to have you there. We'll be talking about parenting topics at least for the next couple of months. And I look forward to your feedback, your questions, any topics that you feel like you'd like to have covered that you feel like haven't been covered yet. I look forward to all of those things, and I will see you